After her husband died, her children divided everything. The old farm was the only thing they didn't want. Margaret Hale was 70 years old when she stood beside her husband's grave and said goodbye to the man she had loved for more than half a century. She thought the hardest part was over. She was wrong. 2 weeks later, her own children sat across from her and began dividing her life as if she were already gone. They took the house. They took the car. They took the bank account. And they left her with an old farm nobody wanted. What happened next would change everything. Hello, my friends. I'm Eleanor Brooks. And when I first heard Margaret's story, I thought I knew exactly how it would end. I've lived long enough to know what usually happens when an elderly widow loses her husband. The bills pile up. The loneliness settles in. The family promises to help. Sometimes they do. And sometimes they don't. Margaret's story began on a cold October morning in Columbus, Ohio. The church was packed. Friends, neighbors, former co-workers, and distant relatives filled the wooden pews beneath stained glass windows that painted the sanctuary in soft shades of blue and gold. At the front of the room stood a simple oak casket. Inside rested Frank Hale. Frank had been Margaret's husband for 53 years. They met in high school. They married when they were both 20. They survived layoffs, recessions, illnesses, and the countless challenges that come with building a life together. They raised 2 children. They paid off a mortgage. They celebrated anniversaries and birthdays. And now Frank was gone. Margaret sat in the front row with her hands folded tightly in her lap. The wedding ring on her finger felt heavier than it ever had before. She wasn't crying anymore. She had done most of her crying during the previous week. Now she simply felt tired. The kind of tired that settles deep into a person's bones. David sat beside her. Karen sat on the other side. Their spouses and children occupied the nearby pews. To anyone watching, they looked like a loving family gathered to support one another through a difficult loss. Margaret wanted to believe that was true. After the service, people approached one by one. They offered condolences. Shared stories about Frank. Promised to stay in touch. Margaret smiled politely. Thanked each person. Repeated the same phrases over and over. By late afternoon, the crowd had thinned. The cemetery grew quiet. Only family remained. The wind carried fallen leaves across the grass. Margaret stood beside Frank's grave a little longer than everyone else. She wasn't ready to leave. Not yet. Frank had always been the strong one. The practical one. Whenever life became complicated, he found a solution. Whenever she worried, he reassured her. For more than 5 decades, she had never truly faced the world alone. Now she had no choice. That evening, David insisted she stay at his house. "Mom, you shouldn't be alone right now," he said. His wife Heather nodded in agreement. "We have plenty of room." Karen agreed immediately. "Just stay with David for a while. At least until things settle down." Margaret appreciated the concern. Or at least what she believed was concern. So she packed a small overnight bag and went with them. She assumed it would only be for a few days. Maybe a week. Long enough to get through the worst of the grief. David's house was comfortable. Large kitchen. Finished basement. Beautiful backyard. The grandchildren were polite. Heather was courteous. Everything seemed fine. For the first few days. Then small things began to change. Conversations stopped when Margaret entered a room. David spent long hours talking on the phone behind closed doors. Karen visited more frequently than usual. Sometimes they disappeared into David's home office together. Whenever Margaret asked what they were discussing, she received vague answers. Just paperwork. Estate stuff. Nothing you need to worry about. Margaret didn't push. She trusted her children. Why wouldn't she? She had spent her entire life loving them. Sacrificing for them. Protecting them. The idea that they might be hiding something never crossed her mind. One evening, about 10 days after the funeral, Margaret walked into the kitchen and found David and Karen sitting at the table surrounded by folders. The moment they saw her, both became quiet. Karen quickly closed a binder. David forced a smile. "Couldn't sleep, Mom?" Margaret looked at the paperwork. "What are you two working on?" "Just organizing Dad's affairs." Something about David's tone felt rehearsed. But she ignored the feeling. Grief can make a person suspicious. At least that's what she told herself. A few days later, David asked her to join him in the living room. Karen was already there. So was Heather. The atmosphere felt strangely formal. Margaret sat down slowly. Immediately, she knew something was wrong. Families don't arrange themselves like that for casual conversations. David cleared his throat. "Mom, we've been reviewing everything." "Reviewing what?" "The finances. The property. Dad's accounts." Margaret frowned. "What about them?" Karen exchanged a glance with her brother. Then she leaned forward. "We think it's time to make some decisions." Those words landed heavily in Margaret's chest. She wasn't sure why. But suddenly the room felt colder. Much colder. And for the first time since Frank's funeral, a quiet voice inside her whispered that perhaps the hardest part wasn't behind her after all. Perhaps it was only beginning. Margaret looked from David to Karen and back again. Neither of them seemed uncomfortable. Neither of them looked nervous. If anything, they appeared prepared. As though they had rehearsed this conversation before she entered the room. David slid a folder across the coffee table. "We've been looking at Dad's estate." Margaret stared at the folder. For a moment, she hated that word. Estate. It sounded so cold. So clinical. As if 53 years of marriage could be reduced to paperwork and signatures. "Your father hasn't even been gone 3 weeks, she said quietly. David nodded. "I know, Mom." "Then why are we talking about this now?" "Because things need to be handled." Karen leaned forward. "We're trying to help." Margaret wanted to believe that. She truly did. But something about the room felt wrong. The sympathy she had felt during the funeral was gone. This felt more like a business meeting. David opened the folder. "The house is worth approximately $480,000. Margaret blinked. "What?" "The house. Why are you telling me that?" "We had it evaluated." Margaret stared at him. "You had our house evaluated?" The word "our" slipped out before she could stop it. Their house. The home she and Frank had built together. The place where they had raised their children. The place where Frank had spent his final years. David avoided her eyes. "We thought it was necessary." Margaret felt her stomach tighten. Karen quickly jumped in. "Mom, please don't get upset. We're just trying to make sure everything is organized." Organized. Another word she suddenly hated. David turned a page. "The investment accounts total around $270,000. Another page. "The checking and savings accounts are about $86,000. Another page. "The car is worth approximately $24,000. Margaret listened in silence. Each number felt like a small cut. Not because of the money. Because of the way they were discussing it. As though Frank's life could be summarized by a spreadsheet. As though their marriage had become a list of assets. Finally, Margaret interrupted. "Why are you doing this?" David exchanged another glance with Karen. It happened so quickly most people would have missed it. Margaret didn't. For the first time, she realized they already knew what they were going to say. Karen folded her hands. "We think it's time to simplify things." Simplify? You shouldn't have to worry about managing everything by yourself. Margaret frowned. "I've managed things my entire adult life." "That's not what I mean." "Then what do you mean?" Silence. A long silence. Then David finally spoke. "We think it would be best if the house was transferred into my name." The room seemed to stop moving. Margaret stared at her son. Certain she had misunderstood. "What did you just say?" "The house." David spoke carefully. Like someone explaining something obvious. "It would make things easier." "Easier for who?" "For everyone." Margaret felt heat rising in her face. The grief. The exhaustion. The loneliness. All of it suddenly mixed together. "Your father was buried 16 days ago." Nobody answered. "The flowers from his funeral haven't even died yet." Still nobody answered. "And you're asking for my house?" Karen shifted uncomfortably. "It's not like that." "Then tell me what it's like." David sighed. "Mom, be reasonable." Reasonable. Margaret had spent decades being reasonable. Reasonable when money was tight. Reasonable when Frank worked late. Reasonable when the children needed things she and Frank couldn't afford. Reasonable when life became difficult. And now her son was asking her to be reasonable while discussing the transfer of her home. Karen spoke softly. "You wouldn't even have to live there alone." "What does that mean?" "We were thinking you could stay with David." Margaret stared at her daughter. "Stay with David. Not visit. Stay." The meaning became painfully clear. A cold feeling settled deep inside her chest. "What about my house?" David rubbed the back of his neck. "We'd probably sell it." The words landed like a physical blow. Sell it. The house. Their house. The kitchen where she baked birthday cakes. The living room where Frank taught the children to play board games. The bedroom where she held his hand during his final weeks. Sell it. Margaret looked down at her hands. For several seconds she couldn't speak. When she finally did, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Have you already decided all of this?" Nobody answered immediately. And that silence told her everything. Because people only hesitate when the truth is uncomfortable. Finally Karen looked away. David stared at the floor. Margaret suddenly understood. This conversation wasn't about asking. It was about informing. The decisions had already been made. The numbers. The evaluations. The folders. The paperwork. This hadn't started today. It had started long before she sat down in that chair. And for the first time since Frank's death, Margaret felt something stronger than grief. She felt betrayed. Not by strangers. Not by lawyers. Not by banks. By her own children. Children she had loved every day of their lives. Children she would have sacrificed anything for. And deep inside, a question began forming. A question she wasn't ready to ask aloud. Had they been waiting for this? Had they been waiting for Frank to die? The thought horrified her. But once it appeared, she couldn't make it disappear. And unfortunately, what happened next would only make that question harder to ignore. Margaret didn't sleep that night. She lay awake in the guest bedroom staring at the ceiling. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Frank. Not the Frank from the hospital. Not the frail man from his final weeks. The younger Frank. The man who spent entire weekends painting their first house because they couldn't afford contractors. The man who worked overtime for years so their children could attend college without crushing debt. The man who never bought himself anything expensive because there was always something the family needed more. Frank had spent his entire life building security for the people he loved. And now those same people were discussing his legacy like items at an estate sale. Around 3 a.m, Margaret finally got out of bed. The house was silent. She walked into the kitchen and poured herself a glass of water. As she stood by the sink, she noticed a light coming from beneath David's office door. Someone was still awake. At first she intended to walk away. Then she heard voices. David's voice. Karen's voice. Margaret froze. The office door wasn't fully closed. Only slightly open. She wasn't trying to eavesdrop. At least that's what she told herself later. But once she heard her own name, she couldn't move. She's going to fight this, Karen said. David sighed. Maybe. We should have done it sooner. Margaret felt her stomach drop. Done what sooner? David answered. I know. A few seconds passed. Then Karen spoke again. If she keeps the house, everything gets complicated. Everything. Not everyone. Everything. Margaret suddenly realized they weren't discussing her well-being. They were discussing assets. Numbers. Property. Money. David lowered his voice. We just need her to agree. And if she doesn't? Silence. Then David said something Margaret would never forget. We'll figure something out. Figure something out. The words sounded harmless. But something about the tone made them feel dangerous. Margaret quietly returned to the guest room. She sat on the edge of the bed until sunrise. For the first time in her life, she didn't know whether she trusted her own children. The realization broke her heart. The next morning, David acted as though nothing had happened. Heather served breakfast. The grandchildren prepared for school. Karen arrived around 10. Everyone smiled. Everyone pretended. Margaret played along. What else could she do? But inside, something had changed. The blind trust she once felt was gone. Later that afternoon, she asked a simple question. What exactly happens if I don't transfer anything? David immediately looked uncomfortable. Karen answered before he could. Nobody's forcing you, Mom. The response sounded carefully practiced. Margaret nodded slowly. Then why are we talking about transferring everything? Neither child answered directly. Instead, Karen launched into another speech about simplifying finances. David talked about reducing stress. They kept using words like protection, planning, responsibility, support. Yet somehow every conversation ended with Margaret owning less and them controlling more. That evening Margaret asked to see the paperwork. The request caught both children off guard. David hesitated. Karen hesitated. Then David handed over the folder. Margaret carried it to the guest room. She spent nearly 2 hours reading every page. The further she read, the more unsettled she became. Most of the documents weren't suggestions. They were transfer documents. Ownership documents. Authorization forms. Account changes. Property changes. Beneficiary changes. It wasn't a discussion. It was a plan. A complete plan. And it appeared to have been prepared long before they officially presented it to her. Margaret sat quietly on the edge of the bed. Her hands trembled. Not because she was confused. Not because she didn't understand. Because she understood perfectly. For years she had believed her children viewed her as their mother. Someone they loved. Someone they respected. But those papers made her feel like something else. An obstacle. A signature. A problem waiting to be solved. Tears filled her eyes. Not loud tears. Not dramatic tears. Just the silent tears of a woman realizing something she never wanted to believe. Frank had only been gone a little over 2 weeks. And already she felt completely alone. The following morning she made a decision. A small decision. But an important one. She called an attorney. Not because she wanted a fight. Not because she wanted revenge. Because for the first time since Frank's death, she felt she needed someone in her corner. Someone who wasn't looking at her house. Someone who wasn't looking at her bank account. Someone who wasn't calculating numbers behind closed doors. The attorney's receptionist scheduled an appointment for the following week. When Margaret hung up the phone, she felt a tiny sense of relief. It wasn't much, but it was enough to help her breathe. Unfortunately, before that appointment arrived, her children would make another move. And that move would change everything. The move came 3 days later. Margaret was sitting at the kitchen table drinking coffee when David walked in carrying another folder. Not the same folder. A different one. Thicker. More organized. More official. The moment she saw it, her stomach tightened. David sat down across from her. For a few seconds, neither of them spoke. Then he placed the folder on the table. "We've been thinking about what you said." Margaret looked at him carefully. "What part?" "The part about not wanting to transfer anything right now." Margaret nodded. "And?" David took a deep breath. "We understand." The answer surprised her. For the first time in weeks, she felt a small sense of relief. Maybe they had listened. Maybe she had misunderstood some of their intentions. Maybe grief had made everyone act differently. Then David opened the folder. And that feeling disappeared immediately. "We came up with another option." Margaret didn't say anything. "We think it would be best if we created a family trust." There it was again. Another plan. Another solution. Another arrangement she had never asked for. David continued speaking. The words sounded polished. Prepared. Almost memorized. The trust would protect the assets. The trust would reduce complications. The trust would make future planning easier. Margaret noticed something. Every sentence began with what the trust would do. Not what she wanted. Not what Frank wanted. Not what was best for her. Just what the trust would do. Karen arrived 20 minutes later. Apparently she had been invited to the meeting. That didn't surprise Margaret anymore. Nothing surprised her now. The two siblings sat beside one another like business partners preparing a presentation. Karen opened her tablet. David reviewed paperwork. Margaret sat quietly and listened. The more they explained, the more concerned she became. Because every proposal seemed to lead to the same destination. Less control for her. More control for them. Finally she interrupted. "Who suggested all this?" David hesitated. "Nobody." Karen immediately looked at him. The hesitation lasted less than a second. But Margaret saw it. After 70 years of life, she had learned something important. People often tell the truth before they speak. Sometimes it appears in their eyes. Sometimes in their silence. Sometimes in the glance they exchange with another person. That brief hesitation told her someone had suggested it. Someone outside the family. Someone helping them. Margaret leaned back in her chair. "Have you spoken to an attorney?" Karen looked away. David cleared his throat. "We just wanted information." Information. Another word she was beginning to dislike. Because every harmless word seemed to hide a larger intention. The conversation continued for nearly an hour. By the end, Margaret felt emotionally exhausted. Nothing had been decided. Yet somehow she felt more pressured than ever. That evening she returned to the guest room and sat quietly beside the window. The sun was setting. Orange light stretched across the neighborhood. Children played in nearby yards. Dogs barked. Cars passed. Life continued normally for everyone else. But Margaret felt as though the ground beneath her feet was shifting. She missed Frank. More than ever. Not because she needed him to solve the problem. Because she needed someone she could trust. Someone who wasn't asking her to sign papers. Someone who wasn't calculating percentages. Someone who wasn't discussing her future as though she weren't sitting in the room. For the first time, she began wondering whether staying at David's house had been a mistake. The thought made her uncomfortable. This was her son. The boy she had carried for 9 months. The child she had stayed awake with through fevers and nightmares. Yet now she found herself locking the guest room door before going to sleep. Just in case. The next morning she received a phone call. The attorney's office. An appointment had become available sooner than expected. The receptionist asked if Margaret could come in the following afternoon. Margaret immediately accepted. After hanging up, she felt something she hadn't felt in weeks. Hope. A small amount. But enough. Enough to remind her that she still had choices. What Margaret didn't know was that before she reached that attorney's office, she would discover something hidden inside Frank's old files. Something that would completely change the way she viewed the situation. And once she found it, there would be no turning back. The following morning, Margaret waited until David left for work. Heather took the children to school shortly afterward. For the first time in days, the house was completely quiet. Margaret carried a cup of coffee into the guest room and sat on the edge of the bed. The attorney appointment was scheduled for the next afternoon. Less than 24 hours away. She should have felt relieved. Instead, she felt restless. Something about the situation continued bothering her. The paperwork. The urgency. The constant pressure. The feeling that decisions had already been made before she was included in the conversation. Margaret looked down at the small cardboard box she had brought from her own house after Frank's funeral. Inside were personal items she hadn't yet unpacked. Photographs. Letters. A few keepsakes. And several folders Frank had kept in his home office. At the time, she hadn't paid much attention to them. Now she suddenly felt compelled to look. Perhaps she was searching for comfort. Perhaps she simply missed hearing Frank's voice through the things he left behind. Either way, she opened the box. The first folder contained insurance information. The second contained tax returns. The third held utility records. Nothing unusual. Then she found a worn manila envelope near the bottom. Frank's handwriting appeared across the front. Margaret. The sight of his handwriting immediately brought tears to her eyes. For a moment, she simply stared at it. She hadn't seen Frank's handwriting since before his illness became severe. Carefully, she opened the envelope. Inside were several documents. A folded letter. And a small brass key. Margaret frowned. The key looked old. Very old. Not a house key. Not a car key. Something else. She unfolded the letter. Her hands trembled slightly. The date at the top caught her attention. Nearly 8 years earlier. Long before Frank became sick. Long before anyone expected him to die. Margaret began reading. The letter wasn't dramatic. It wasn't emotional. In fact, it sounded exactly like Frank. Practical. Organized. Thoughtful. As she read, her heart began beating faster. Frank explained that he had spent years organizing their finances. He wrote that unexpected things happened in life. People became sick. People passed away. Families changed. Relationships changed. And because of that, he wanted Margaret to know where certain records were stored. The letter listed several locations. A safe deposit box. An attorney. Financial accounts. Property records. Everything seemed ordinary. Until she reached the final page. There, Frank mentioned something Margaret had almost forgotten. The farm. Her father's farm in Kentucky. The same farm nobody in the family ever talked about. The same farm David and Karen had dismissed as worthless. The same farm Frank had specifically refused to sell during their entire marriage. Margaret sat upright. She read the paragraph again. Then a third time. Frank wrote that certain records related to the farm were stored separately. He also mentioned that the brass key belonged to an old lock located inside a building on the property. No explanation. No details. Just a short note. If you ever decide to visit the farm again, don't throw anything away until you've checked everything carefully. That sentence stopped Margaret cold. She stared at the page. Checked everything carefully. Why would Frank write that? What was he talking about? The farm had been abandoned for years. Nobody lived there. Nobody visited. The property barely generated enough income to cover taxes. At least that's what everyone believed. Margaret suddenly remembered something. Several weeks before his death, Frank had mentioned the farm during one of their conversations. At the time she hadn't thought much of it. He had been tired. Weak. Drifting in and out of sleep. But she remembered him saying something unusual. Don't let anyone rush you. She had assumed he was talking about funeral arrangements. Now she wasn't so sure. Margaret looked down at the key again. A strange feeling settled over her. Not excitement. Not hope. Curiosity. The kind of curiosity that refuses to disappear. A few hours later Karen called. Margaret almost didn't answer. Almost. But old habits are difficult to break. Hi, Mom. Hello. Karen sounded cheerful. Too cheerful. We were wondering if you've had time to think about everything. There it was again. Everything. Always everything. Always the paperwork. Always the transfers. Always the plans. Margaret glanced toward the envelope lying on the bed. For the first time, she decided not to share what she had found. Not yet. Something told her to keep it to herself. So she simply replied. I'm still thinking. Karen sounded disappointed. Only for a second. Then her cheerful voice returned. Well, let us know. After the call ended, Margaret sat quietly for a long time. The envelope remained beside her. The brass key rested in her palm. For the first time since Frank's funeral, she felt something changing. Not in the family. Not in the situation. Inside herself. The fear was still there. The grief was still there. But now something else had appeared. A question. Why had Frank gone out of his way to leave instructions about a farm everyone considered worthless? And why had he waited nearly 8 years to tell her where to find them? Margaret didn't have the answer. Not yet. But before the week was over, she would make a decision that would take her hundreds of miles away from David's house. Back to Kentucky. Back to the farm. And back to a secret that had been waiting there for decades. Margaret kept the envelope hidden. Not because she was planning anything. Not because she distrusted her children completely. At least not yet. But something deep inside told her to stay quiet. For now. The next afternoon, she attended her appointment with the attorney. The office was located in a modest brick building near downtown Columbus. Nothing fancy. Nothing intimidating. Just a quiet place where people went when they needed answers. Margaret arrived carrying Frank's envelope inside her purse. She wasn't sure why. Perhaps she simply wanted to feel closer to him. Attorney Susan Reynolds greeted her warmly. Within minutes, Margaret found herself describing everything that had happened since Frank's funeral. The meetings. The paperwork. The trust proposals. The discussions about transferring assets. Susan listened carefully. She interrupted only occasionally to ask questions. When Margaret finished, the attorney leaned back in her chair. Then she asked a simple question. Have you signed anything? No. Susan nodded. Good. The answer surprised Margaret. Good. Very good. Margaret frowned. Susan folded her hands. Mrs. Hale, as long as you haven't signed anything, you remain fully in control of your assets. A wave of relief washed over her. It wasn't a complete solution. But it was something. For the first time in weeks, someone was speaking to her directly instead of speaking around her. Susan continued. You are under no obligation to transfer your home. No obligation to transfer your accounts. No obligation to create a trust. Margaret listened carefully. Every sentence felt like a weight lifting from her shoulders. Then Susan asked another question. Do you own any other property? Margaret hesitated. Then she mentioned the farm. The moment she did, Susan's expression changed slightly. Not dramatically. Just enough for Margaret to notice. The farm in Kentucky? Yes. Do you still have the deed? I think so. Susan nodded thoughtfully. Keep it. The answer seemed odd. It's not worth much. Maybe. The attorney smiled politely. But keep every document related to it. Margaret immediately thought about Frank's letter. The key. The instructions. The warning not to throw anything away. For the second time in 2 days, she felt that strange sense of curiosity. After the meeting ended, Susan handed her a business card. If anyone pressures you to sign anything, call me first. Margaret placed the card in her purse. On the drive back to David's house, she couldn't stop thinking about the farm. Memories began returning. Summer visits as a child. Fields stretching toward the horizon. The old farmhouse. The weathered red barn. Her father, Henry, walking the property before sunrise. The farm had never made much money. At least that was what everyone always said. But her father had refused to sell it. Year after year. Offer after offer. Even when neighboring properties changed ownership. Even when developers showed interest. Henry Hale never sold. Back then Margaret assumed it was stubbornness. Now she wasn't so sure. That evening she made another decision. A much bigger one. She was going to Kentucky. The idea seemed ridiculous at first. The farm was nearly 300 miles away. The buildings were old. The property had been neglected for years. And yet she couldn't shake the feeling that Frank had left those instructions for a reason. After dinner she informed David. I'm going away for a few days. David looked surprised. Where? Kentucky. The room became very quiet. Karen happened to be visiting. Margaret noticed both siblings exchange a quick glance. The same glance. The one she had seen repeatedly over the past few weeks. Why Kentucky? Karen asked. The farm. Karen laughed softly. The farm? Margaret didn't like the way she said it. As if the property were a joke. As if it had no value whatsoever. I just want to take a look. David forced a smile. Mom, there's nothing there. Maybe. Maybe not. Margaret simply shrugged. I'll find out. The conversation ended shortly afterward. But later that night, while walking past the hallway, Margaret overheard something that made her pause. Karen's voice. Low and urgent. Why now? David answered. I don't know. Do you think she found something? Several seconds passed. Then David replied. No. But he didn't sound confident. Not at all. Margaret quietly returned to her room. Her heart was racing. Found something. The words echoed in her mind. Why would they assume she might have found something? Unless they believed there was something to find. The next morning, Margaret packed a suitcase. A few changes of clothes. The deed. Frank's letter. The brass key. And the attorney's business card. When she finished, she looked around the guest room one final time. For weeks she had felt trapped. Confused. Powerless. Now, for the first time since Frank's death, she felt a sense of purpose. She didn't know what waited for her in Kentucky. Maybe nothing. Maybe an abandoned farm and a lot of unanswered questions. But one thing was certain. Before she made another decision about her future, she intended to learn exactly why both her father and her husband had been so determined to keep that property. And within 48 hours, standing inside an aging red barn beneath decades of dust and forgotten memories, Margaret would discover the first clue. The drive to Kentucky took nearly 6 hours. Margaret hadn't made the trip in years. The farther she traveled from Columbus, the quieter she felt. The constant pressure. The endless conversations. The paperwork. The tension. For the first time since Frank's funeral, all of it seemed farther away. By late afternoon, she turned onto a narrow county road lined with aging oak trees. The farm appeared a few minutes later. Margaret slowed the car. For several seconds, she simply stared. Time had not been kind to the property. The white paint on the farmhouse had faded. Sections of fencing leaned at odd angles. Weeds stretched across portions of the field. The old red barn looked exactly as she remembered. Large. Weathered. Silent. A strange mixture of sadness and comfort settled over her. This place contained some of her oldest memories. She had learned to ride a bicycle here. Learned to drive a tractor here. Learned how stubborn her father could be here. After parking the car, Margaret stepped outside. The air smelled different. Cleaner. Simpler. For a moment, she could almost hear her father's voice carried by the wind. Close the gate behind you. The memory made her smile. Then it made her cry. She stood beside the car until the tears passed. Afterward, she wiped her face and began walking toward the farmhouse. The interior was dusty but intact. Nothing appeared unusual. Old furniture remained exactly where she remembered. Family photographs still hung on the walls. The grandfather clock in the hallway stood frozen at a time nobody remembered. Margaret spent the first few hours cleaning. Opening windows. Sweeping floors. Trying not to think too much. But eventually her attention returned to the brass key. The key Frank had left behind. The key connected to the farm. The key connected to the barn. As evening approached, Margaret carried a flashlight outside. The red barn stood near the far edge of the property. Its large wooden doors creaked loudly when she pulled them open. Dust drifted through shafts of sunlight. The smell of old wood filled the air. Nothing seemed unusual at first. Just farming equipment. Workbenches. Shelves. Boxes. The same things she remembered from childhood. Then she remembered another detail. Her father never allowed anyone inside a small storage room located at the rear of the barn. Not once. Not ever. As a child, she had asked about it repeatedly. Henry Hale always refused. No explanation. No discussion. The answer was always no. Margaret walked toward the room. The door remained exactly where she remembered. Heavy. Solid. Covered in dust. And locked. She stared at the old padlock hanging from the latch. Then she slowly reached into her pocket. The brass key felt cool against her fingers. For a moment she hesitated. Maybe it wouldn't fit. Maybe Frank had been referring to something else entirely. Maybe she had driven 6 hours chasing nothing but memories. Then she inserted the key. The lock clicked immediately. Margaret froze. Her heartbeat quickened. The key fit perfectly. She stood motionless for several seconds. The silence inside the barn suddenly felt enormous. Carefully, she removed the padlock. Opened the door. And stepped inside. The room was smaller than she expected. No treasure. No hidden documents. No mysterious chests. Just shelves. Old tools. Boxes. And decades of dust. Margaret almost laughed. Maybe that was all there was. Maybe the mystery ended here. Then her flashlight beam moved across the floor. She stopped. The concrete looked different near the back wall. Most of the floor was worn and cracked with age. One section wasn't. One section appeared newer. Smoother. Almost as if it had been poured separately. Margaret slowly approached. Her pulse quickened again. She crouched beside the concrete. ran her hand across the surface. The difference was obvious. Even after all these years, someone had intentionally covered something. The realization sent a chill down her spine. Margaret stood and looked around the room. Against one wall rested an old steel pry bar, the kind her father used for repairs around the farm. She picked it up, then looked back at the unusual section of concrete. Part of her wanted to leave, to wait until morning, to call someone. But another part of her knew she wouldn't sleep if she walked away now. So she knelt beside the concrete and tapped it lightly with the metal bar. The sound echoed differently. Hollow. Margaret stopped breathing. She tapped again. The same result. Not solid concrete. Hollow. Something existed beneath it. Something large enough to change the sound entirely. Her hands began trembling. Not from fear. From anticipation. Because suddenly she understood something important. Frank knew. Her father knew. And whatever they had been protecting all these years was hidden directly beneath her feet. Margaret looked around the dark barn one final time. Then down at the strange section of concrete. The questions that had haunted her for weeks suddenly felt very real. What had her father hidden? Why had Frank protected it? And why had nobody ever spoken about it? The answers were finally within reach. But before Margaret uncovered what lay beneath that floor, she would need help. Because what she was about to discover was far bigger than anything she could have imagined. Margaret spent very little time sleeping that night. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the concrete floor inside the barn. The hollow sound. The strange section that didn't belong. The realization that both Frank and her father had known something she didn't. By sunrise, she had made a decision. She needed help. Not from David. Not from Karen. Not from anyone connected to the arguments waiting back in Ohio. She needed someone local. Someone who knew the farm. Someone she could trust. A few hours later, she drove into the nearest town. The place looked almost exactly as she remembered. A single main street. Small businesses. A diner. A hardware store. A feed supply shop. The kind of town where people still recognized one another. As Margaret stepped into a local diner, an elderly man sitting near the window stared at her for several seconds. Then his eyes widened. Margaret Hale? She stopped. The voice sounded familiar. Very familiar. The man stood. Older now. Thinner. More gray hair. But unmistakable. Tom Briggs? The man laughed. I'll be damned. Tom Briggs had lived on the neighboring property when Margaret was growing up. Years ago, he and her father had worked together during harvest season. Margaret hadn't seen him in decades. The two spent nearly an hour talking. They discussed old neighbors. Family members. The changes that time brings to every small town. Eventually the conversation turned toward the farm. Tom's expression changed immediately. You staying out there? For a few days. Tom nodded slowly. Place has been sitting quiet a long time. Margaret hesitated. Then she decided to ask. Tom, can I ask you something? Sure. My father. Tom smiled. Now there was a stubborn old man. Margaret laughed softly. That's one way to describe him. Tom took a sip of coffee. What about him? Margaret lowered her voice. Did he ever talk about the barn? The smile disappeared. Not completely. Just enough for Margaret to notice. Tom looked out the window. Then back at her. Why are you asking? The answer immediately raised her suspicions. Most people would have said no. Or yes. Tom did neither. Instead, he asked a question. Margaret decided to be honest. Because I found something. Tom studied her face carefully. For several seconds he said nothing. Finally he nodded. I wondered if someday somebody would. Margaret's pulse quickened. What does that mean? Tom sighed. Your father was a good man. That doesn't answer my question. I know. The old man leaned back. Then he lowered his voice. Your father didn't trust banks. Margaret blinked. What? He trusted land. Tom paused. And he trusted things he could see with his own eyes. The conversation became stranger with every sentence. Margaret waited. Tom continued. After your mother passed away, he changed. How? He became secretive. That part was true. Margaret remembered it clearly. The older Henry Hale became, the more private he seemed. Especially concerning the barn. Tom stared into his coffee. There were rumors. What kind of rumors? The old man chuckled softly. Small-town rumors. Tell me anyway. Tom shrugged. People said Henry was hiding something. Margaret's heart began pounding. What? No idea. Tom smiled. That's why they were rumors. The answer should have been disappointing. Instead it made Margaret even more curious. Because for the first time, she realized the mystery hadn't started with Frank. It had started decades earlier. Back when Henry Hale was still alive. When lunch ended, Tom handed Margaret a business card. The front simply read. Briggs Excavation Services. Margaret stared at it. Tom grinned. You look like somebody who's about to dig something up. The statement sent a chill through her. For a moment neither of them spoke. Then Margaret laughed. Not because it was funny. Because it felt oddly accurate. That afternoon, Tom drove out to the farm. Together they entered the barn. Margaret led him into the locked storage room. The moment he saw the section of concrete, his expression changed. The joking disappeared. The smile vanished. He crouched beside the floor. Tapped it several times. Then stood. Well? Tom looked directly at her. You're right. The words echoed through the room. Margaret felt her heart racing. What is it? Tom shook his head. I don't know. Then he pointed at the concrete. But something is definitely under there. For several seconds, neither of them moved. Margaret stared at the floor. Tom stared at the floor. The barn felt completely silent. Finally Tom broke the silence. If you want answers. Margaret looked at him. He pointed toward the excavation truck parked outside. We're going to have to open it. Margaret looked back at the concrete. At the place her father had hidden. At the place Frank had protected. At the place nobody had touched for decades. Every question that had haunted her since Frank's death suddenly seemed to lead to this exact moment. The house. The bank accounts. The pressure from her children. The letter. The key. The barn. Everything. Margaret slowly nodded. Tom smiled. Then let's see what your father was trying so hard to keep hidden. Neither of them knew it yet. But buried beneath that floor was something that would change Margaret's life forever. The excavation began the following morning. Neither Margaret nor Tom expected what they were about to find. At first, the work moved slowly. Tom used a concrete saw to cut around the unusual section of flooring. The sound echoed throughout the barn. Dust filled the air. Margaret stood nearby, watching silently. Every minute felt longer than the last. For decades, nobody had touched this place. Now, piece by piece, the secret was finally being uncovered. Several hours later, the concrete slab was removed. Beneath it sat a large steel hatch. Margaret stopped breathing. Tom stared at it. Neither of them spoke. The hatch looked old. Very old. But it had been built to last. A thick layer of rust covered the surface. Yet the structure remained solid. The moment Margaret saw it, she knew something important. Her father hadn't hidden something by accident. This had been planned. Carefully. Deliberately. Years of effort. Years of secrecy. All hidden beneath the floor of an old barn. Tom knelt beside the hatch. There has to be a way to open it. Margaret immediately thought about Frank's letter. The key. She reached into her pocket. Slowly removed the brass key. Tom's eyes widened. That might do it. The lock mechanism sat near the center of the hatch. Margaret inserted the key. For a moment, nothing happened. Then she turned it. A loud metallic click echoed through the barn. Both of them froze. The lock released. Tom laughed quietly. I guess your husband knew exactly what he was doing. Margaret felt a lump forming in her throat. Frank. Even after his death, he was still protecting her. Still guiding her. Still helping her find answers. Together, they pulled on the heavy steel handle. The hatch resisted at first. Then slowly opened. A rush of cool air emerged from below. Darkness stretched beneath them. Tom grabbed a flashlight. Margaret's hands trembled. Not from fear. From anticipation. For weeks she had been searching for answers. Now they were finally within reach. A narrow staircase descended into the darkness. The walls appeared to be reinforced concrete. Whoever built this place had invested serious money and effort. Tom shined the flashlight downward. I'll go first. Margaret nodded. Carefully, they descended the stairs. The temperature dropped immediately. The air felt cool and dry. The staircase seemed endless. Finally they reached the bottom. Tom swept the flashlight across the room. Then he stopped. Margaret heard him whisper something. What is it? Tom didn't answer. The flashlight remained fixed in one direction. Margaret stepped forward. And suddenly she understood. Rows. Hundreds of rows. Shelves stretched across the underground chamber. Every shelf was filled with glass bottles. Thousands of them. Margaret stared in disbelief. For a moment, her brain refused to process what she was seeing. The bottles were dusty. Old. Perfectly preserved. Each one sealed. Each one labeled. The underground room seemed enormous. Far larger than the barn above. Tom slowly turned in a circle. My God. Margaret walked toward the nearest shelf. She picked up one bottle carefully. The label looked ancient. The date printed near the bottom made her eyes widen. 1958. She grabbed another. 1961. Another. 1963. Every bottle appeared decades old. Tom looked stunned. Do you know what this is? Margaret shook her head. No. Tom laughed nervously. I think your father left behind one of the largest private bourbon collections I've ever seen. The words hung in the air. Margaret looked around again. Shelf after shelf. Row after row. Thousands of bottles. The scale of it felt impossible. Why would her father do this? Why hide it? Why never tell anyone? Questions flooded her mind. Then she noticed something else. A wooden desk sat against the far wall. Unlike everything else in the room, it appeared intentionally arranged. Almost as though someone expected it to be found someday. Margaret approached carefully. A single envelope rested on the surface. Dust covered everything around it. Yet the envelope itself appeared protected. Waiting. The front contained only 2 words. For Margaret. The sight made her heart stop. Her father had written those words. She recognized the handwriting instantly. Tom stepped back, giving her space. Margaret picked up the envelope. For several seconds she couldn't move. Her father had been gone for years. Yet somehow he was speaking to her again. The underground chamber. The bottles. The hatch. The key. All of it suddenly felt connected. Margaret carefully opened the envelope. Inside was a handwritten letter. Several pages long. The first sentence brought tears to her eyes. Because at that moment she finally realized something. Her father had never intended this secret to remain hidden forever. He had been waiting for her. And the truth contained in that letter would explain everything. Margaret sat down slowly. The underground chamber felt silent. Not empty. Not abandoned. Silent. As though it had been waiting. Waiting for this exact moment. The letter trembled slightly in her hands. Tom remained several feet away. Giving her privacy. Giving her space. Margaret unfolded the first page. Then she began reading. My dearest Margaret. If you are reading this, then two things have happened. First, I am gone. Second, you finally ignored my instructions and opened something I told you not to touch. A tear rolled down Margaret's cheek. She laughed softly despite herself. That sounded exactly like her father. Even decades later. Even from beyond the grave. The letter continued. I know you probably have questions. You deserve answers. The first answer is simple. Everything in this room belongs to you. Margaret stopped reading. Her eyes moved across the shelves. Thousands of bottles. Thousands. She looked back at the page. Then continued. Years ago, I made a mistake. I trusted the wrong man. A business partner. A friend. Someone I believed would honor his word. Instead, he tried to take everything. Margaret read every line carefully. The story unfolded piece by piece. Years earlier, Henry Hale had operated a successful bourbon business. Not a large corporation. Not a famous brand. But a respected operation. He built it from nothing. One barrel at a time. One customer at a time. Then the partnership collapsed. The betrayal nearly destroyed him. Lawsuits followed. Threats followed. People came looking for assets. People came looking for money. And Henry decided to disappear the most valuable inventory he owned. Margaret slowly looked around the underground room. The bottles. The shelves. The hidden chamber. Now it made sense. The letter continued. I built this room because I refused to let dishonest people take what I spent my life creating. If you're reading this, enough time has passed. The people who wanted these bottles are long gone. The fight is over. The secret no longer matters. The inventory belongs to you. Margaret lowered the letter. For several seconds she couldn't speak. Tom watched quietly. Finally he asked the obvious question. How many bottles are down here? Margaret looked around. Then laughed weakly. I have no idea. Tom shook his head. It has to be thousands. The realization felt overwhelming. Margaret returned to the letter. Several additional pages explained how the inventory had been catalogued. Storage records. Production years. Documentation. Everything appeared carefully organized. Her father had prepared for this moment. Years before his death. Years before Frank's death. Years before the conflict with David and Karen. Then Margaret reached the final page. The page that changed everything. The handwriting looked slightly different. More emotional. Less formal. If life has treated you kindly, then consider this a gift. If life has treated you poorly, consider this a second chance. But whatever you do, don't let anyone convince you that your worth depends on what you own. You were worth more than all of this the day you were born. Margaret could no longer hold back the tears. She closed her eyes. For weeks she had felt abandoned. Alone. Forgotten. Now, somehow, her father was reminding her exactly who she was. Not a burden. Not an obstacle. Not a signature on a piece of paper. His daughter. Tom finally broke the silence. What are you going to do now? Margaret looked around the underground chamber. The answer was simple. She had no idea. The next several days passed in a blur. Photographs were taken. Inventory records were reviewed. Security measures were installed. Most importantly, Margaret contacted a professional appraiser. The appointment took longer than expected. Several experts needed to be consulted. Some bottles were extremely rare. Others appeared almost impossible to find. The more information they gathered, the more unbelievable the situation became. 1 week later, the lead appraiser arrived at the farmhouse carrying a thick binder. Margaret invited him inside. Tom joined them at the kitchen table. The appraiser opened the binder. Adjusted his glasses. Then looked directly at Margaret. I've been doing this for 32 years. Margaret nodded. The man paused. As of today, this is one of the most valuable private collections I've ever evaluated. Margaret felt her heartbeat accelerate. Tom leaned forward. Nobody spoke. The appraiser turned a page. The conservative estimate. He paused. Is between $20 and $30 million. The room went completely silent. Margaret stared at him. Certain she had misheard. $20 million. $30 million. The numbers sounded impossible. Absurd. Unreal. She had arrived at the farm believing she owned a forgotten piece of land nobody wanted. Now a professional expert was telling her she possessed one of the most valuable collections in the country. Tom slowly sat back in his chair. The appraiser continued explaining figures. Insurance requirements. Market demand. Collector interest. But Margaret barely heard any of it. Her thoughts were somewhere else. Back in Columbus. Back in David's living room. Back to the conversations about the house. The car. The bank account. And for the first time, Margaret realized something ironic. The one thing her children considered worthless had become the most valuable thing she owned. What she didn't know was that very soon, David and Karen were going to discover exactly what she had found. And their reaction would be unlike anything she expected. Margaret did not tell David. She did not tell Karen. She did not tell anyone in Columbus. At least not immediately. For nearly 2 weeks, she remained at the farm. The appraisers came and went. Security specialists installed cameras. Insurance representatives inspected the property. Collectors began making inquiries. Everything moved faster than Margaret expected. Yet she remained cautious. For the first time since Frank's death, she felt as though she was finally in control of something. And she wasn't eager to surrender that control again. Unfortunately, secrets of that size rarely remain hidden for long. The first sign of trouble arrived on a Tuesday afternoon. Margaret was reviewing paperwork at the farmhouse kitchen table when her phone rang. David. She stared at the screen for several seconds. Then answered. Hello? His voice sounded unusually cheerful. Hi, Mom. Margaret immediately became suspicious. David hadn't sounded that cheerful in weeks. How are you? I'm fine. Still at the farm? Yes. A brief silence followed. Then David asked the question. So, what's going on down there? Margaret leaned back in her chair. What do you mean? Oh, nothing. The answer came too quickly. Much too quickly. Margaret waited. Eventually David continued. I heard you've been meeting with appraisers. There it was. Somehow he knew. Margaret wasn't surprised. Small towns have always had a way of sharing information. What about it? Another pause. Then David laughed. The sound felt forced. Mom, come on. Margaret said nothing. You found something, didn't you? The directness startled her. For a moment she almost answered. Almost. Then she remembered the trust documents. The house. The bank accounts. The meetings behind closed doors. And she chose her words carefully. I found my father's property. David's cheerful tone disappeared. The conversation ended a few minutes later. But something had changed. Margaret could feel it. The next day Karen called. Then Heather. Then even one of her grandchildren asked when she was coming home. Home. Margaret found the word interesting. Because suddenly nobody seemed eager to sell her house anymore. Nobody seemed eager to move her into a spare bedroom. Nobody seemed concerned about simplifying her finances. Instead, everyone wanted to know how she was doing. What she had found. How long she planned to stay. The change was impossible to miss. 3 days later, David arrived at the farm unannounced. Margaret looked through the kitchen window and saw his SUV pulling into the driveway. Her stomach tightened. Not from fear. From disappointment. She had hoped she was wrong. Hoped she had misunderstood everything. Hoped her children were simply grieving badly. Now she wasn't so sure. David entered carrying a smile. Flowers. And a grocery bag. The performance was almost convincing. Almost. For the next hour, he talked about family. About memories. About how much he missed Frank. Margaret listened politely. Then eventually the conversation turned. Just as she knew it would. So. David stirred his coffee. I heard some interesting rumors. Margaret looked at him. What kind of rumors? The farm. There it was. Finally. David leaned forward. People are saying you found something valuable. Margaret remained silent. David continued. You know you can trust me. The words hurt more than they should have. Because once upon a time, she would have believed them without hesitation. Not anymore. Margaret set her coffee cup down. Can I ask you a question? Of course. When your father died. David immediately looked uncomfortable. Margaret noticed. When you wanted the house. Mom. When you wanted the accounts. That's not fair. When you wanted me to sign those papers. She looked directly into his eyes. Were you thinking about me? Silence. Heavy silence. The kind that tells the truth before anyone speaks. David looked away first. Margaret already had her answer. He eventually left before sunset. Neither of them argued. Neither of them raised their voices. And somehow that made the conversation even sadder. Because Margaret realized something important. The greatest loss wasn't the house. Or the money. Or even the betrayal. The greatest loss was trust. And once trust disappears, rebuilding it can take a lifetime. The following week, another surprise arrived. Not from David. Not from Karen. From the courthouse. A certified envelope. Margaret opened it slowly. The moment she read the first page, her blood ran cold. David had filed a petition. A legal petition. The filing claimed Margaret might no longer be capable of managing her own affairs. The request sought authority for David to oversee her finances. Her property. Her decisions. Everything. Margaret sat frozen at the kitchen table. The words blurred before her eyes. Not because she didn't understand. Because she understood perfectly. After failing to convince her. After failing to pressure her. After failing to persuade her. Her own son had decided to involve the court. The woman who had raised him. The woman who taught him to walk. The woman who worked extra shifts so he could attend college. Now being described as incapable of managing her own life. For several minutes, Margaret simply stared at the paperwork. Then she reached for her phone. There was only one person she wanted to call. Attorney Susan Reynolds. Because for the first time, this was no longer a family disagreement. It was a fight. And Margaret had finally decided she was done standing alone. Attorney Susan Reynolds didn't sound surprised. That was the first thing Margaret noticed. After reading the petition over the phone, Susan was quiet for several seconds. Then she asked a simple question. Have you seen a doctor recently? Margaret blinked. Yes. Good. Why? Susan's voice remained calm. Because this happens more often than people realize. The answer made Margaret's stomach sink. More often. How many elderly parents had sat where she was sitting now? How many had been forced to defend their independence against their own children? For the next several weeks, Margaret and Susan prepared. Medical evaluations. Financial records. Property documents. Tax filings. Investment statements. Everything. Susan wanted evidence. Not emotion. Not accusations. Facts. Margaret appreciated that. Because facts don't care who feels offended. Facts simply exist. The hearing was scheduled 6 weeks later. During those 6 weeks, David called repeatedly. Karen called repeatedly. Both insisted they were only trying to help. Margaret stopped arguing. Stopped explaining. Stopped defending herself. She simply listened. And every conversation revealed something she hadn't noticed before. Neither child ever asked, "Mom, how are you feeling?" Neither child ever asked, "Are you lonely?" Neither child ever asked, "What do you need?" Instead, they asked about the farm. The appraisals. The property. The future. The money. Always the money. By the time the hearing arrived, Margaret felt strangely calm. The courthouse was smaller than she expected. Plain brick walls. Metal detectors. Long hallways. Nothing dramatic. Just another government building. Yet the moment she entered the courtroom, her heart tightened. Because David was already there. So was Karen. For a second, Margaret saw them not as adults, but as children. The little boy who used to run through sprinklers during summer. The little girl who once cried because she found an injured bird. The memories hurt. More than the lawsuit. More than the betrayal. Because somewhere along the way, those children had become strangers. The hearing began shortly afterward. David's attorney spoke first. The argument was simple. Margaret was elderly. Margaret had recently suffered emotional trauma. Margaret had made unexpected financial decisions. Margaret might be vulnerable to outside influence. Susan listened without reacting. Then it was her turn. She stood. Presented medical evaluations. Presented cognitive assessments. Presented financial records. Presented evidence showing Margaret had managed her own affairs successfully for decades. One document after another. One fact after another. The truth slowly filled the room. Margaret watched the judge carefully. The older man remained expressionless for most of the hearing. But every so often, he would glance toward David. And each time, his expression became slightly harder. Finally, the judge addressed Margaret directly. "Mrs. Hale." "Yes, Your Honor." "Do you know why you're here today?" Margaret nodded. "Because my son believes I can't manage my own life." A few people shifted uncomfortably. The judge continued. "And can you manage your own life?" Margaret looked directly at him. Then answered honestly. "I buried my husband." The courtroom became silent. "I traveled across 2 states alone. I managed property issues. I hired legal counsel. I coordinated appraisals. I reviewed financial records. And I showed up here today." She paused. Then added. "If I can't manage my own life, Your Honor, I'd like someone to explain exactly which part I'm failing at." The silence that followed seemed endless. Even Susan smiled. The judge nodded slowly. Then he looked toward David. For the first time all morning, disappointment appeared on the man's face. Not anger. Disappointment. Which somehow felt worse. The ruling came less than 20 minutes later. The petition was denied. Completely. Margaret retained full control of her finances. Full control of her property. Full control of her future. The case was over. Just like that. Afterward, people began leaving the courtroom. David remained seated. Karen sat beside him. Neither looked up. Margaret watched them for several seconds. Part of her wanted to be angry. Part of her wanted an apology. Part of her wanted an explanation. Instead, she felt tired. Very tired. Outside the courthouse, Karen approached first. Tears filled her eyes. Real tears. Not courtroom tears. Not strategic tears. The tears of someone finally seeing herself clearly. "I'm sorry, Mom." Margaret said nothing. Karen continued. "I should have stopped this." Another tear rolled down her cheek. "I knew it was wrong." For several seconds, neither woman spoke. Then Margaret stepped forward and hugged her daughter. Not because everything was fixed. Not because trust had returned. Because healing has to start somewhere. David never approached. He left through another exit. Susan watched him go. Then looked at Margaret. "You okay?" Margaret nodded. "I think so." But she wasn't completely sure. Some victories don't feel like victories. Some victories feel like funerals. Months passed. Margaret sold portions of the collection carefully. Not all at once. Only enough to secure her future. The farm was restored. The farmhouse was repaired. The debts disappeared. The fear disappeared. And eventually something unexpected happened. Peace returned. Not the peace she once had. A different peace. A stronger peace. One built on experience instead of assumptions. One spring morning, nearly a year after Frank's death, Margaret stood on the front porch watching the sunrise. The farm looked beautiful. Alive. Hopeful. Behind her, workers prepared a new building near the property entrance. A community center. One dedicated to helping elderly people facing financial exploitation and family pressure. A place where people like Margaret could find guidance before it was too late. The sign near the road carried a simple name. Hale Community Aid. A tribute to Henry. A tribute to Frank. And a reminder that even after betrayal, something meaningful can still grow. Before I finish today's story, I'd like to ask you something. If you were in Margaret's position, would you have forgiven Karen? And what would you have done about David? Let me know in the comments. I read every one of them. And I'd love to hear your thoughts.